Some of the most interesting findings so far: schizophrenia, which often manifests with hallucinations and jumbled speech, is tied to parts of the brain used for speech, so the ability to speak could have outweighed the small, but unavoidable risk that the genes involved in language could malfunction and result in schizophrenia in a small percentage of the population. People who live in colder European regions are a bit more likely to develop schizophrenia, making it possible that cold weather adaptability and schizophrenia are linked genetically. If genes that helped people tolerate cold were located close to variants that promote schizophrenia in the genome, then the latter could have been inadvertently carried along during evolution as a fellow traveler. Researchers also looked at the regulation of genes in early humans and Neanderthals. For example, early humans may have expressed a gene associated with language ability more than Neanderthals, even though both had the gene. The extent of mental illness amongst Neanderthals, if it even existed at all, is unknown, but this difference in gene expression could be vital to understanding its origins. What's happening? The scientists found that climate change already is having an impact worldwide on health, labor productivity, food scarcity, the spread of infectious disease, and exposure to air pollution and heat waves. Between 20 million 2016, there was a 46% increase in the number of weather-related disasters. Some metrics, per the study and its accompanying press release: cases of mosquito-borne dengue fever have doubled every decade since 1990, partly since mosquitoes thrive better in warmer weather. AP reports that there's similarly an increase in tick-borne Lyme disease in the US, as ticks also fare better with warmer weather. Vulnerable adults, such as those over 65 or with chronic disease, are facing a greater number of heat waves. Between 2000 and last year, the number of adults facing debilitating heat waves rose by 125 million. Global exposure to dangerous levels of air pollution has increased by 11.2% since 1990. 71% of 2,971 cities exceed the recommended levels of air pollutants. Increasing temperatures have led to about 5.3% in loss of labor productivity. Economic losses linked to climate-related extreme weather events were estimated at $129 billion in 2016. Only 40% of the countries reported having taken measures to increase the climate resilience of their health infrastructure to plan for emergencies from severe storms and flooding. Medical care can be damaged from compromised electricity and water supplies, interrupted supply chains, disabled transportation links, and disrupted communications and IT networks. Be smart. Global temperatures have increased 0.75 degrees Fahrenheit since 2000, but local changes can vary widely from that seemingly incremental change, The Washington Post points out. One warning quote: The Wash Post writes that Nick Watts, executive director of Lancet Countdown, says if anybody says we can adapt our way out of this, the answer is, of course you can't. Details of the study, as detailed by MIT Technology Review, researchers analyzed 34 young adults, even split between suicidal participants and a control group. Each person was sent through a functional magnetic resonance imaging fMRI and given 3 lists of 10 words all relating to suicide, such as death or distressed, positive effects such as kindness or innocence, or negative effects such as evil or guilty. They studied 5 specific brain locations that were determined to be the best marks to distinguish the suicidal patients from the controls. Using those locations and words, the machine identified 15 of the 17 patients with suicidal behavior and 16 of 17 control subjects. The suicidal participants were then split into 2 groups, those who had attempted suicide and those who hadn't, and the machine was trained to distinguish the differences. Mind the Gap. Today the UN released its latest emissions gap report, a yearly look at the difference between emissions trajectories needed to have a good chance of staying at the 2 degrees Celsius ceiling and what's expected under nations' current policies. Full implementation of nations' carbon-cutting pledges to the UN, called Nationally Determined Contributions Indices, make a temperature rise of at least 3 degrees Celsius by 2100 very likely, the UN said in a summary. The NDCs cover only about a third of the emissions needed to be on a least-cost pathway for the goal of staying well below 2 degrees Celsius. Ticking clock. If the emissions gap isn't closed by 2030, it's extremely unlikely that temperatures can be held well below 2 degrees Celsius. Even if all pledges are enacted, the carbon budget, or total amount of emissions that can be spewed to stay within a given target, for the 2 degrees Celsius ceiling will be 80% depleted by 2030. not impossible. The gap can be closed by adopting already known and cost-effective technologies. By the numbers, current Paris pledges make 2030 emissions likely to reach 11 to 13.5 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent GTCO2e, above the level needed to stay on the least cost path to meeting the 2 degrees Celsius target. 1 gigaton is roughly equivalent to 1 year of transport emissions in the European Union, including aviation, a UN summary states. To be sure, nobody ever envisioned that nations' existing pledges would be enough, and the Paris deal is designed to bring more ambitious efforts over time. However, the report is a stark reminder of the big steps needed to meet scientists' estimates of how much emissions must be curbed to stay under the temperature targets. Wait, there's more. A separate PwC UK report released yesterday looks at the big picture too. It notes that last year global GDP growth was 3.1%, but emissions grew by only 0.4%. So carbon intensity, that is, emissions per unit of GDP, fell by another 2.6%, a drop consistent with the last few years. Yes, but that's not even the 3% average rate of decarbonization needed to meet the existing national pledges in the Paris deal. And it's less than half of the 6.3% annual level needed to stay well below the 2 degrees Celsius ceiling, a PwC said. The reports arrived just ahead of the latest round of UN climate talks in Bonn, Germany, next month. The rate of increase of atmospheric CO2 over the past 70 years is nearly 100 times larger than that at the end of the last ice age. As far as direct and proxy observations can tell, such abrupt changes in the atmospheric levels of CO2 have never before been seen, the group said. However, while CO2 emissions from human activities were again at record levels in 2016, the annual increases slowed and even plateaued, the report notes. In order to halt species extinction, researchers are suggesting conservation efforts should focus on islands, which hold 41% of the world's known highly threatened vertebrates, per a study published recently in Science Advances. Why this matters: not only are species lost forever, never to be enjoyed or seen again, the decline of biodiversity has also affected human health, economics, food security, etc., study author and conservation biologist Dina Spatz tells Axios. What they did: the team reviewed more than 1,000 datasets and consulted more than 500 experts worldwide. They identified and mapped all 1,189 land-based amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals listed as critically endangered or listed on the International Union for Conservation of Nature's Red List of threatened species that breed on the 1,288 islands around the world. They checked which islands had overlapping populations of invasive species, including rats, cats, goats and pigs, which Spatz called some of the most damaging invasive species on Earth. The team also gathered some social, ecological and political information that could be of significance for conservation planning. The outcome: the team created the Threatened Island Biodiversity Database for governments, researchers and advocates to use to map out conservation plans to reduce biodiversity loss globally by managing invasive species. What they found: while islands make up only 5.3% of the Earth's landmass, they are home to 41% of the world's highly threatened vertebrates. A disproportionate amount of threatened species, she says. Spatz, currently at the non-profit Island Conservation, says she finds it interesting that 95% of all the threatened species in the dataset occurred on at least one island with an invasive vertebrate. Islands with the most highly threatened vertebrate populations include Madagascar, Sri Lanka, Hispaniola and Cuba. Good news: while this may seem daunting, the good news is that there are proven techniques for dealing with the threat of invasive species, and thus management of invasives on these islands could benefit 39% of the Earth's highly threatened vertebrates, Spatz tells Axios. More perspective: Robert Fisher, a conservation biologist with the U.S. Geological Survey, points out the study is based on highly threatened vertebrates as classified by the IUCN's Red List, which is incomplete. Fisher, who was not part of this study, says that IUCN so far has only assessed roughly 40,000 out of 61,000 vertebrates, and the list does not include species that may be labeled as data deficient because they were only assessed once. We should be investing a lot of money in exploration and discovery right now to better determine which species are threatened, Fisher tells Axios. Still, Fisher says the database is a good baseline tool in fighting the extinction of species, which has cascading effects. An example of this is on Guam, where brown tree snakes were introduced and killed birds, which led to a huge increase in spider populations. This damaged tourism centered around birdwatching on the island and prompted concerns snakes could similarly invade Hawaii. The New Yorker's Annals of Science appealed to make exercise obsolete. What if a drug could give you all the benefits of a workout? By Nicola Twilley. The drug works by mimicking the effect of endurance exercise on one particular gene. By binding itself to the receptor for this gene, the drug reconfigures it in a way that alters the messages the gene sends, boosting the signal to break down and burn fat. But I called Tim Wilson, the drug's designer, to ask whether he would take it. No, he said, without hesitation. I contacted the other researchers and found that none of them had ever taken an exercise pill, in any form. Pump iron. Ash created in low-temperature fires, under 840 degrees Fahrenheit, is gray or black in mostly organic carbon, whereas ash created in hotter fires is white because most of the carbon has burned away, leaving calcium and magnesium. Depending on the chemical composition of the ash, it will be hydrophobic or hydrophilic. Rainfall will mix with more hydrophilic ash and could enter streams. If the ash is hydrophobic, it will repel the water and may then run off quickly, washing soil away in the process. If the ash runs off into streams, it could eventually reach the San Francisco Bay and stimulate algal blooms. With the volume of ash created in the recent fires, these potentially large blooms could eat all the dissolved oxygen out of a waterway, making it unlivable for everything else. Per Wired, if it stays on land, a mixture of calcium oxide in certain types of ash and rain could create a layer of cement like limestone on forest floors. Basically, the ash can pave a forest, Rogers writes. The big question: scientists have experience with ash from burned vegetation, but the recent California fires burned both forests and cities. So the resulting ash will be full of heavy metals and toxins. No one knows exactly how much, and it depends on what burned and at what temperature. The bottom line from Rogers, all of which means the real trick in Northern California will be debris cleanup. By studying brain tissue that is typically disposed of during surgery, the Allen Institute for Brain Science in Seattle is building 3D computer reconstructions of the shape and electrical signals sent by brain cells, per NPR. Christoph Koch, chief scientist and president of the institute, told NPR that previous research on the electrical activity of neurons has relied on samples from animals. This research, therefore, could help indicate what is unique about the human brain and bring better understanding of brain diseases. In order to understand what makes us who we are, we really need to study the human brain, Koch said. How they're doing it during brain surgery. Healthy tissue is often removed along with diseased tissue, and then discarded. So we now have people inside or just outside the operating room who receive those pieces of brain, put them in a special container and then rapidly move them over here, Koch told NPR. The scientists then keep the tissue alive until they can get them in the lab and study them. So far they've looked at the electrical behavior of about 300 neurons from 36 different people. The Allen Institute recently received 5-year grants totaling $100 million from the NIH toward its work creating these atlases of brain cells. A species of critically endangered lemur in Madagascar may be at even more risk if climate change continues to affect its bamboo diet, according to Science News. What's happening while other lemurs species have a more diverse diet? The greater bamboo lemur eats bamboo alone even throughout the dry season, when plants offer only culm. The tough, old, yellowing stems pour in nutrients. The researchers project the dry seasons will last longer than normal in the future because of climate change, which could leave the lemurs without a nutritional food source for longer periods. Why it matters: the greater bamboo lemur Proelermersimus has neared extinction once before. Right now, the lemur species is only found in places with the shortest dry season, researchers wrote in Current Biology.